Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. In the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, we are really depending on the hard work and dedication of essential workers. From doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers, to those involved with the production, distribution, and sales of essential goods, like prescription drugs or food, these folks are doing such important work. We thought, what better subject could we explore in today's episode than a man who, at his own peril, refused to leave his post and made the ultimate sacrifice to save as many other lives as he possibly could. In so doing, he became a folk hero and legend. In the episode, we ride the rails with the heroic Casey Jones on his last fateful ride into history. But before we get to that, if you caught last week's episode, you know we have had to suspend all of our tours due to COVID-19. We're hoping to reopen as soon as it is safe to do so. Until then, if you live in Canada, you can bring the Haunted Walk to you with our brand new home and board rescue packs. Get autographed Haunted Walk books, swag, and other spooky surprises delivered right to your doorstep. You can find a link to our new online store on our homepage of our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. Also on the homepage, you can find a link to purchase gift cards, which is another great way to help us out during these unprecedented and challenging times. The gift cards can be purchased wherever you are in the world and never expire. There's also no minimum purchase, so even if you think it unlikely you'll be visiting any of our cities in the near future, it is a quick and easy way to make a small donation to help us fight to keep the business going. On a personal note, after going quiet for several weeks as we attempted to figure out a plan for the business, I was overwhelmed by how many of you listened to the last episode. It is an incredible and humbling feeling to have such a wide and loyal audience. So thank you to each and every one of you. It provided a much-needed boost to morale. Please be sure to share Haunted Talks with any family or friends you think would enjoy it, and leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us is a great and easy way to help support the show.
Well, here's a little story about an engineer. Take a little time and lend me an ear. He used to make the freight train the moan and groan, talking about the ghost of Casey Jones, a moaning and a groaning, rolling it down the line. The old ghost of Casey Jones is making his engine whine.
That was the ghost of Casey Jones, recorded by Rod Morris in 1958. There are two kinds of ghost stories. There are the frightening or unexplainable tales that keep us awake at night, challenging our very notions of reality. The other are events or individuals whose stories are so profound or moving that they haunt our collective imaginations and beg the question, what would we do if faced with a similar situation? The story of Casey Jones falls into this second category. Casey was running fast as he entered an S-curve just outside of Vaughan, which prevented him from seeing straight down the track. His fireman, Sim Webb, had a better vantage point, and he was the first to realize that there was something on the main line. Casey Jones ordered his fireman to jump from the cab, and after he did, he reversed the throttle and slammed on the air brakes. The last thing Webb heard as he jumped, knocking himself unconscious in the process, was the long, piercing scream of the train whistle. Like all great legends, there is often a combination of fact and fiction to go into the retelling of the story. No, Casey Jones was not born in a locomotive's cab. In fact, his real name was not even Casey. He was born into the backwoods of southeastern Mississippi in 1863 as John Luther Jones. In pursuit of a better life for their 5 children, the family moved out of the wilderness to Kentucky when Luther, as his mother called him, was 13 years old. On the 2-day journey, he heard a sound that would steer the course of the rest of his life and cement his place into American history. It was the huffing and puffing of steam, with a whistle that pierced the night. Much to the surprise of the other family members and travelers, though he had never heard a train before, Casey instantly knew what it was and stood trembling in the night with excitement and possibility. The family's final destination was a tiny village called Casey, spelt C-A-Y-C-E. Luther would be fascinated seeing the trains pass through his small town. In fact, through his burning curiosity, he began to be recognized by more and more members of the train crews that stopped there. He would often ask the men questions and even started reading books about mechanical engineering. He was a quick study and loved just watching the trains operate. He had his mind made up. One day, he was going to be a railroad engineer. After convincing his mother that he could not be dissuaded, he packed up all of his things in a small suitcase and headed down to the station. When a familiar train crew saw Jones with his bag in hand, they offered him a free ride to Columbus, Kentucky, to see the boss of the line. This was the first time he had ever ridden a train, and he experienced it all from the locomotive's cab. When he arrived at the company office, the young man, still only 15, got a bit of a hard time from the old-timers when he asked to become a telegraph operator on his way to becoming an engineer. In a very fortunate turn of events, the boss was a big baseball fan, and he had seen Jones play the year before and knew he could help the local team win some games. To his great delight, Jones was granted an apprenticeship to become a telegraph operator. While the job did not pay, he believed that getting a foot in the door toward his dream would pay him back soon enough. As there were many men with the last name Jones working for the company, he was immediately given the nickname Casey, C-A-S-E-Y, from his hometown and where the other men had often seen him. Casey went diligently about his work, and after much teasing, eventually found his place with the railroad workers. In addition to learning about becoming a telegraph operator, he was also learning new lessons about the world. Very close to the train depot, to put it generously, was a tavern. Perhaps more realistically, there was a brothel. One quiet Sunday, as Casey was working in front of the office, 2 men suddenly exploded out of the front door of the establishment. It was clear both men were very drunk, and the one chasing the other, with the pistol in his hand, was quite angry. What exactly caused the altercation was never discovered, but most speculation leaned towards a gambling disagreement or a conflict over one of the women who worked in the establishment. The sight of the pistol in the man's hand caused Casey to freeze in fear, a feeling which only intensified as shots rang out and the 2 men drew closer and closer. The man being chased ran right past Casey, putting the young man directly between the barrel of the gun and its target. Locked in place, Casey could only watch in terror as the very inebriated man took shaky aim and fired a shot. Miraculously, it just missed Casey's head. A few days later, Casey found the bullet lodged in a nearby piece of machinery, and a few days after that, the body of the shooter was discovered. He had suffered a crushing blow to the top of his head by an unknown assailant. No arrests were ever made. Casey thought he had gotten his big break when the company found themselves short a telegraph operator during a very busy period. He was pressed into official service and by all accounts performed very admirably. However, when another operator showed up to relieve him the following night, he really felt betrayed and unappreciated. What he did not know is that the wheels had already been set in motion to change his life. The head office had recognized Casey's value and potential, and soon thereafter he received orders to report to the head office in Jackson, Tennessee. Once there, he learned he was going to become a brakeman. As Jones' biographer Fred J. Lee describes it, braking the train in those days was difficult and hazardous, as there were no air brakes or brakes of any kind on the locomotives. Much depended on the brakeman's ability to manipulate the handbrake on each car. The work was doubly dangerous and disagreeable during the months of winter. Furthermore, the cars were equipped with pin and lock couplers, a direct cause of many lost fingers and maimed hands when the brakemen were fortunate enough to escape being thrown beneath the wheels of the car. The work was hard and the hours long, but Casey was not one to complain. He knew it was all part of the process leading him to the locomotive. He learned the routes and the tricks of the trade. Not too long after, Casey was involved in another dangerous situation. One of his co-workers took him to see the impressively large Illinois Central Yards in Cairo, Illinois. There, he went to a diner called the Blue Goose, located right on the grounds, and whose main clientele were railroad workers. While the 6'4" Casey had a reputation as a gentle giant, when an even bigger patron began to bully and threaten his friend, Casey saw red and demanded the bear-like man apologize at once. The request was not well received, and the man lunged for Casey with a roar. Casey easily redirected the attack and caught the man with a hard punch to the face before tossing him like a rag doll to the floor with a satisfying thud. Like a movie, the rest of the patrons erupted in applause. The hulking and defeated man was generally disliked by all for being a bully and a bore. From the yard in Cairo, the first legend of Casey Jones, spun like a David versus Goliath story, began to spread like wildfire among those who worked the rails. Casey began to be treated with increased respect and friendliness by the other men. Though still underage, his bosses quickly approached him about a promotion to the position of fireman, which would get him into the locomotive by tending to the fire that drives the engine. After several weeks, where he once again displayed his great aptitude, Casey was given the chance by the engineer to operate the engine himself. Unsurprisingly, he was a natural, which only fueled his desire to have a train of his own. During this time, Casey married Janie Brady, who was the daughter of one of the family boarding houses that he would stay in. Before proposing, though, Casey had to ask her if she thought they could live on half his salary, because he was sending the other half home to support his parents in Casey. She approved, agreed, and they were married. By the time Casey turned 29, he had achieved his dream of working as an engineer for the Illinois Central Railroad. His reputation continued to grow as he was known to regularly achieve speeds of over 100 miles per hour and was known to always get her in on time. Casey worked as an engineer on a shuttle service during the Chicago's World Fair in 1893. There, at the company's pavilion, he first laid eyes on engine 638. The polished behemoth immediately captured his imagination, and he had a feeling it would drive as good as it looked. Due to his reputation and influence within the company, he was able to ensure, as soon as the fair ended, he would be driving that locomotive. As Fred J. Lee writes, steaming pompously out of the cities and towns and gliding gaily through the open country went the 638, while her proud young runner took occasion to display his skill with the whistle, an instrument of a single note only, but under the magic touch of Casey Jones, capable of producing an indescribably fascinating sound. A sound so entirely identified with Casey himself that it was recognized throughout the countryside. No other could reproduce that whistle song. No other sound could so arouse the interest of grown-ups and excite the imagination of children. On one run, while pulling 638 into the station at Michigan City, Mississippi, Casey saw a group of children run across the track ahead of the train. All of them made it across with plenty of time to spare, except one little girl who stopped frozen in the middle of the tracks, staring at the huge and oncoming locomotive. While the train was already slowing for the station, it would not stop in time. Casey heroically moved out to the very nose of his machine, and by reaching out as far as he could, he was able to scoop the little girl up into the crook of his arm as the train rolled on. Tragedy had been avoided at the very last possible moment.
Driving that train, I'm cocaine. Casey Jones, you better watch your speed. Trouble ahead, trouble behind. And you know that notion just crossed my mind.
That was Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead's unique take on the story of Casey Jones. In 1900, Jones was transferred to Memphis, Tennessee, for a passenger run from Memphis to Canton, Mississippi. This 300-kilometer or 185-mile route offered the fastest schedules in the history of the American railroad. Some engineers thought the route to be too dangerous and quit driving it. But for Casey Jones, who loved and had a well-earned reputation for being a fast driver, well, it suited him just fine. On April 29, 1900, after another engineer fell ill, Casey was asked to pick up an extra run. The night began with a challenging start as the train he was to drive arrived late in Memphis, forcing Casey and his crew to depart 1 hour and 15 minutes behind a difficult schedule already. However, with a good fireman by the name of Simeon Webb and a fairly light passenger train, Casey believed he could make up the time and put her into Canton on time, a feat that would be nothing short of miraculous. The train had 3 scheduled stops and usually traveled around 50 miles per hour. If lost time was to be made up, Casey would need to push it to 60 miles per hour and even faster on the best sections of track. The powerful locomotive charged through the night toward a tragic date with destiny. By the time the train had completed 174 miles of the 185-mile route, it was now only 2 minutes behind schedule. What this meant is that Casey would have had to gone well over 75 miles per hour or 120 kilometers per hour for good stretches of the track. This is faster than the speediest trains are allowed to travel in Canada today, some 120 years later. Trouble was waiting at the station in Vaughan, Mississippi. Casey's orders had indicated that there would be a local passenger train there, but not on the main line, and that he and his train had the right of way. In fact, there were 3 trains in the Vaughan station as Casey made his final approach. The railroad workers had been moving these trains in an intricate dance to make sure they could get them all off the main line before Casey arrived. However, when an air hose broke on one of the engines, locking its brakes, it caused 4 cars to be left on the main track. To unfold the next part of the story, we have a special guest. Before his death in 1955, Sim Webb, who was Casey's fireman and in the locomotive with him that night, recorded his account of the accident. It is fascinating to hear a first-hand account of events that have in some ways transcended history and become folklore.
8 miles below Durant and 27 miles from the end of our run at Canton. We had been running at very high speed. Weather and visibility were fairly good, and Casey Jones hoped to bring us in on time at 4:05 a.m. Our engine was one specially built for these trains by the Rogers Locomotive Works and had drivers 6 feet tall. On today's fine road beds, it would have traveled 100 miles an hour, possibly more. We may easily have reached that speed, and we certainly reached 90 often. The section of the line from Memphis to Grenada had recently been purchased from another railroad, and the track had pretty light rail. This fact, rather than the fast schedule, I think, caused some of the engineers to pass up the job on that fast train. From Grenada to Canton, however, the rails were standard weight. Anyway, the time was made up, put Casey in a good humor, and he talked and joked with me all along. Sim, he said, if you keep the old girl hot, we'll go into Canton on time. I said, well, I'll keep her hot. And naturally I did. We took siding at Goodman and were hardly in the clear before number 2's headlight showed up from the south. After it passed, we backed out on the main line and began the last 27 miles of our trip. 15 miles south of Goodman is the little town of Vaughan, approached by an S-curve, which swings first to the right, then back to the left. Naturally, on this type of curve, the engineer and fireman of the steam locomotive cannot see the track ahead at the same time. As we entered the curve, I put in a fire and climbed up and looked out of the cab window on my side, so that when we swung to the left, I could look ahead with a clear view of the siding and station. As we came out of the curve, there right ahead of us were the red rear markers of a train. Showing red meant that it was on the main line. At once I yelled to Casey, "Oh my Lord, here's something on the main line." He jumped to his feet, looked diagonally across the top of the boiler, at the same time setting the air brakes in emergency stop. He had to reach up to do it, as the valve was located high on these engines. "Jump, Sim, jump," he shouted. I jumped across the deck, grabbed the handrail, slid down as far as I could go, then turned loose. Casey never had a chance. The engineer's seat on one side and the long boiler which divided us, the cab, on the other side, made escape practically impossible. Hitting the ground knocked me unconscious. I woke up about 30 minutes later to hear voices say, "Here he is." When I was able to talk, I asked about the engineer, and they told me Casey was killed. We had hit the caboose of the freight train, gone through it, a car of hay, a car of corn, and halfway through a car of lumber, all of them on the main line, the rest of the train on the siding. We had no orders against this train or any other except number 2, which we had already passed. Our clearance card gave us rights over everything, and we didn't have to look out for anybody. If a train is blocking the main line, railroad rules require that a flagman must go out 10 telegraph poles distance and place 2 warning torpedoes 2 rail lengths apart, then a stop torpedo. If a train approaches, he must also light a red fusee. This flagman must remain out until called in. Without warning, we plowed into that caboose. The wreck occurred at 3:52 a.m., and as we had only 12 miles to go, with a clear track, we probably would have arrived at Canton safely on time. If we had been properly warned, Casey Jones might have been alive today.
They say the wail of Casey's whistle and the ensuing crash could be heard for miles around. The train was traveling too fast to stop in such a short distance. The locomotive smashed through the caboose, a car of hay, a car of corn, and halfway through a car of lumber before finally leaving the track. As Casey biographer Fred J. Lee writes, "It is traditional that a captain must stay with his sinking ship, and a locomotive engineer to face certain catastrophe with hand on the throttle and air brake lever, devoting the last few moments of his life to diminishing as much as possible the disastrous effects of an impending and unescapable crash." The heroic adherence to this tradition by Casey Jones when his locomotive plowed into the rear of a freight train at Vaughan that dark, foggy morning was unquestionably the reason why many lives, besides his own, were not snuffed out, and why many persons were not maimed or mutilated. A passenger on Casey's train reported that the passengers did not suffer and there was no panic. "I was jarred a little in my bunk, but when fairly awake, the train had stopped and everything was still." Engineer Jones did a wonderful as well as a heroic piece of work at the cost of his own life. The marvel and mystery is how Engineer Jones stopped that train. The railroad men themselves wondered at it, and of course, the uninitiated could not do so less. But stop it he did, in a way that showed his complete mastery of his engine, as well as his sublime heroism. I imagine that the Vaughan wreck will be talked about in roundhouses, lunchrooms, and cabooses for the next 6 months, not alone on the Illinois Central, but on many other roads in Mississippi and Louisiana. Casey's body was found in the derailed locomotive beneath the bale of hay, with his hands still clutching the whistle cord and the brake. His watch had stopped at the exact moment of the accident, 3:52 a.m. The exact cause of death has been reported differently through the years. Some say it was a metal bolt that was driven through his neck. Others say it was a splinter of wood from the lumber car that had been driven through his head. Others say he was crushed or scalded to death by the steam of his own engine. Despite Casey's act of heroism, the Illinois Central Railroad tried to blame the entire thing on him, saying the accident was solely his responsibility for ignoring a flagman outside of Vaughan and warning devices that were placed directly on the tracks. Sim Webb, the fireman, maintained until his death that "we saw no flagmen or fuses, we heard no torpedoes. Without any warning, we plowed into that caboose." Many historians also believe the findings of the Illinois Central Railroad to be very convenient for the company, if not outright problematic. The next morning, Jones's body was transported on the long trip back to Jackson, Tennessee. The following day, the funeral service was held in St. Mary's Church, where he and Janie Brady had married 14 years before. He was buried in Mount Calvary Cemetery. If you visit his tombstone today and have a sharp eye, you may notice something unusual. It lists his year of birth as 1864, a year later than his actual birth in 1863. This accidental error was made by two railroad enthusiasts who had donated the tombstone, replacing a simple wooden cross that had marked his grave for close to 50 years. Casey's wife, Janie, said she never thought of remarrying and wore black nearly every day for the rest of her life. Some quiet night, maybe as you lie in bed, you will hear the distant sound of a lonesome train whistle. Perhaps it will cause you to think about the heroic Casey Jones and allow you to imagine that he is still out there driving that locomotive and riding the rails, doing all he can to put her in safely on time. Here is a little of the great Johnny Cash singing the ballad of Casey Jones.
Come all you rounders if you want to hear the story about a brave engineer. Casey Jones was the roller's name. On a 6-seater wheel, the boys he rode to fame. Well, the caller called Casey about 4:30. Kissed his wife at the station door. Climbed in the cabin with his orders in his hand. Said, this is my trip to the promised land. Casey Jones mounted to the cabin. Casey Jones, orders in his hand. Casey Jones, leaning out the window, taking a trip to the promised land.
Thank you once again for joining us for the episode. If you enjoyed this topic and railroad stories in general, I would like to recommend to you to check out episode 76, where we read Charles Dickens' supernatural classic, The Signalman, which some argue is the greatest ghost story ever written, and certainly I would say the greatest railroad-themed ghost story ever written. If there is a topic you would like us to explore on the show, always feel free to send me an email. My email address is jim@hauntedwalk.com. Please be sure to visit our website, hauntedwalk.com, to purchase your gift certificates and to find the link to our brand spanking new online gift shop, featuring our home and board rescue packs. If you enjoyed the show, we would appreciate it if you could recommend it to friends and family, and we always love receiving 5-star reviews wherever you listen to us. As always, a very special thanks to our audio editor, Michelle Dennis, and to Kevin McLeod at Incompetech.com for the additional music. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.